Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wednesday, September 27th, is still ambient work group meeting. So first up on the agenda is Aton and Yossi.
Hi. Yes, so I think that we kind of got the answer from Keith in the issue itself, but maybe it's worth raising this scenario. So if you go into the issue, the sample scenario that we had in mind is the scenario today in Ambient. There is a difference between authorization policy that are being applied to the waypoint versus the one that is being applied to and will be enforced by the Z-tunnel. So the difference today is in the selector. So if you want the authorization policy to be enforced by the waypoint, you need to provide the selector for the waypoint. The other cases that we found, and it's kind of it's not very edge, but it's very common that when users or customers has the layer 4 policy in place and with set Z-tunnel without any waypoint, and then they want to deploy a waypoint, then in that case, unless they modify the selector for all the existing authorization policies, unless they do that, then because today, whenever the Z-tunnel understand that there is a waypoint on the way, it just skip the enforcement and not doing any policy enforcement. In that case, no one is going to enforce the layer 4 policies unless the selector is being updated. So it's kind of security problem, if I may say, but it turns out that there is an in place the document which is already approved by Keith with the layer targeted authorization policy. And in that case, when the user is specifying layer equals transport, the expected behavior is that if there is no waypoint, then of course the Z-tunnel is going to enforce this policy. But if there is a waypoint, then nothing is going to be changed. The envoy is going to enforce the same policy for layer 4. So I think that it kind of answers the use case that we had in this issue. So, yeah.
It does answer the question. I guess the only thing is this is not too straightforward to the user, right? So basically, you are asking user to do stuff even for Z-tunnel, just layer 4. I was just thinking loud because for me, it took me a while to get it. I just think for user, it will take them some time and it was a surprise.
So one of the consequences of the layer targeted operation policy design is that users start to think about what layer their policy is being applied kind of from the get-go. And that's kind of inherent within the ambient design. If you want to start, and that learning curve already exists. Like if you want to start, doing checking JWT claims or doing request path matching an authorization policy with just Z-tunnel, you are already going to not be able to do that. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to, as part of that same learning curve, you start kind of essentially notating your policies with what layer it's targeted for. and it gives us a heuristic to be able to consistently apply a policy to make sure there's no gap, just by adding that heuristic in the spec.
Yeah, I'm just thinking loud here. Is there anything we can make this a little bit easier? Or do we have to ask user, hey, you, before you do anything, you have to change your OSC policy pretty much, whether you're using layer 4 or whether you're using layer 7. Because the way I'm seeing right now, because before when I look at your proposal case, I'm thinking, okay, when if I'm not changing my OSC policy, basically I'm setting layer to onset, right, which is the default behavior, which is fine, and it works for, I believe it works for Z-tunnel, in the case Z-tunnel I use, which is super cool. But now I'm thinking that's actually not good, because you don't know when other people would deploy a waypoint. From a service producer and consumer perspective, you don't control, I guess.
I mean, yes, the user will have to change their authorization policy, but in my understanding would be that a lot of users would be having to change their authorization policies migrating over to Ambient in general, right? The kinds of policies that are often written would, at least from my experience, tend to be, I've seen very few policies that are just L4. If you want to require a cert, then you'll use pure authentication instead. You may have some IP blocks, but most users I've seen are wanting to, do path matching or only certain HTTP operations, things like that. So there's already going to be some churn inherent in adopting Ambient. We've also, for beta, we've scoped the goal down to just greenfield installs. So kind of with those two axioms in tow, I guess to me, it doesn't feel like a lot to have a user start to think about their policies as far as what layer they're going to be enforced at, because now there's not a sidecar doing all the enforcement. You have two different places things can be enforced. So I think the sooner we can get the user thinking in those terms, the better.
Yeah, I saw a lot of hands, so maybe somebody next in the hand should chime in before.
Yeah, I think I was up. I feel like this issue, the next issue, the past issue, the one before that, basically everything we've talked about for the past few months is really pointing to the architecture being wrong. And now we're seeing the consequences of it, now that we're getting a lot more experience with it. Every issue keeps coming back to the fact that we do this hairpinning and the waypoints kind of magically capture everything on the workload. Like I can't think of a single issue we've talked about in the past 2 months that doesn't come back to that issue. And, I'm starting to think that we may need to rethink broader decisions we've made. I think, Mitch, you tried to talk, but then I heard a weird beeping noise. Oh, maybe not.
I think Carsten is next.
Completely agree with John, of course, but I mean, at least for hairpinning. But I want to my regular, announcements that we also have the option to, if the user has to change the API and they need to make changes, maybe we should reconsider supporting, network policy with some extensions where it pass identity, and at least the user will migrate to something that, makes sense and will be supported in more broadly. That's my usual, announcement.
Can you hear me better now?
Yep.
John, I was just asking, what are the alternatives to hairpinning? Like, what sort of changes are you thinking?
Yeah, I think we fundamentally get in this tricky territory when we declare that a waypoint is a waypoint for workloads rather than a service-oriented thing. Like gateways, like an ingress gateway is a service thing generally, right? You expose google.com, you don't expose, I don't know, some Borg job ID 123. We get into a lot of awkward territory there, right? That means that all traffic that goes to the pod, we need to loop through the waypoint, which adds all this hairpinning issues that we've talked about. And this is another aspect of that as well. We kind of, one of the original motivations for doing that was so that we could implement our workload-based policies like authorization policy. But we don't actually do that. We decided that that was kind of crazy to implement. And we removed that and said, now the workload-based policy is attached to the waypoint. And so now we have these waypoint-based policies, but they're really not workload-based. They're waypoint-based. It seems like to me at this point, we've gone so far towards getting to the point where we could just have services attached to waypoints. Like there's some extreme edge cases where you want to apply L7 policies to traffic directly to a workload. But it seems quite rare that you're not actually going through a service. Like in the original Istio model, we moved to workload-based policies instead of service-based ones because you have multiple services or zero services, or you could have some services but not call it. So attaching authorization policy to services is kind of wonky. But because now with waypoints, a service could be an actual physical piece of infrastructure, not just a VIP, we can actually enforce like the traffic went through the service and apply the service policies, right? It's physically a different thing to go through the service or not go through the service. So we could say, for example, I want a waypoint for service X. I want an authorization policy on service X. And then I furthermore want to add a network policy that says all traffic to these pods must go through service X because I don't want people to bypass it. The last step, of course, could be optional or more nuanced. Maybe you want to say, traffic can come from service X, or it can come from Prometheus, who's going to scrape me directly and not go through the waypoint, right? So it would be a large change for sure. But I think a lot of the problems we're getting ourselves into is to try and, work from the Istio APIs backwards into the new architecture instead of working from how existing, things work and then try and give the functionality we want to users. And I will say I played a large part in that. That was my philosophy in every aspect of design, was do whatever crazy stuff we need to do to make Istio work and then see if we can untangle it later. And I'm worried that we're not doing the best job untangling things.
Sanjeev, you've had your hand up for a while, so I don't want to jump the queue.
Sure. I have two sort of questions / comments. The first one is more of a question, clarify current expected behavior. If I have an auth policy, so we've documented that quote unquote L4 auth policies are implemented by zTunnel. But it is sort of implied what an L4 auth policy is. So is it fair to say that a policy that essentially does not have a method or operation, whatever the methods and the operations field is effectively in, if the from field is an L4 classification and the to field does not have any methods or operations, that is what constitutes an L4 policy. Is that an accurate statement? Because we sort of never state that explicitly.
L4 policy is implicitly defined in the code somewhere where it's anything that can be determined at the TCP layer. So I don't know the exact thing. It's like identity, IP, and port or something. There may be some other thing. Anything that's
right
at a higher level is yeah.
Okay. So yeah. So basically, I think I believe what it translates to is most of the cases for L4 policy are when you either don't have an operation specified at all, because most of the operations are HTTP methods, or there is a ports field in the two under two. So it's all kind of little bit wishy-washy. I mean, not wishy-washy, but vague. So are we saying now that if I have a policy, an existing policy which meets those rules and hence is an L4 policy that normally would be applied by Z-tunnel, if according to Keith's proposal, the layering that is added essentially overrides any implicit logic. The layering is an explicit direction whether to process this at Z-tunnel or at waypoint. Is that Keith your proposal that the layering field would explicitly dictate whether this should be treated as a Z-tunnel enforced policy or a waypoint policy?
Yes, effectively.
Okay, yeah, so I'll probably go through your proposal later. So that was just a clarification. Now, the other comment is that we've talked on and off, and this kind of relates to John's comment about architectural sort of reclarification. We've talked on and off about parts of the Z-tunnel overlapping with CNI logic, and obviously policy is one of those. So would this be the right time to sort of clarify whether the future we envision includes both an L4 CNI layer policy and an L4 istio layer policy, or a combined L4 policy that's sort of a combination of CNI layer and istio layer? And also that has to be not just CNI layer, because you can have VM workloads as well, which Kubernetes network policy doesn't do anything for VM workloads. So is this the right time to sort of have a converged position on the overlap of L4 functionality of Ambient with the CNI's L4 functionality? I mean, should that be sort of taken up as a piece of work to kind of have a position on whether we're going to have two layers of L4 enforcement, or are we moving towards a single L4 enforcement?
So I think there's two different parts of that question, right? We don't control what is offered by the CNI implementations, right? But we have information that they do not have at L4. Right, so you could easily see a world where Kubernetes network policy is custom described, but we support things like peer identity, right? That certainly, the Kubernetes network policy based specification doesn't specify that. Implementations may or may not implement that. And so do we say that that's right? Would a user then have two network policy implementations? Yes, would be the answer, right?
If you need it. I mean, again, if you can make
right, yes.
using only net namespace, you can use either of them. It's both the same thing. And if you want to express allow from my namespace and ingress namespace, no problem. Network policy covers that.
There's quite a lot of overlap. Is it a problem, right, for the end user that there are two potential of the same API, different semantics, right? Active, right? The CNI sec and the network policy API doesn't have a class attribute, right? It assumes that there's one and only one CNI implementing. So what would it mean, right, to start writing ISIO specified network policy resources, right, with attributes of certificate in the check? Like, let's say we start to allow you to write policy against the issuing intermediate CA's location.
So
right, perfectly reasonable things to think about.
So
the other CI wouldn't understand it, and it would cause problems.
Yeah, agreed that current state of Kubernetes network policy does not cover all the scenarios that a service mesh style L4 policy. I mean, so neither of these are complete. But what should the direction be? Should the direction be to continue to have two layers of L4-ish policy and the Kubernetes L4 policy does what it does, and we will have another L4 policy at the service mesh layer. And then we can sort of address these kinds of issues like the Z tunnel versus waypoint thing, or that we have a statement of direction to try and have one layer of L4 policy working with the Kubernetes community. Yeah, it'll be a little bit of a political issue, sort of, but the reason I say it is because there's been some discussion in the Istio group I've heard, which is talk about converging some or all of the Z tunnel with the CNI layer. Even there was a Justin's talk at Istio also suggested that.
Yeah, by the way, the discussion you guys are having actually reminded me how, Cilium network policy, right, which is a derived version from Kubernetes network policy, and how nice it actually supports smooth transition from as user grow from layer 3, layer 4 to layer 7. I don't believe as a user of Cilium, I would have to, kind of using this layer thing to kind of untangle my model between layer 3, layer 4 to layer 7. I actually really like that model to allow, the smooth transition between the two.
Yes, and it's a single sort of converged policy model that automatically does L3 or L4 or L7.
Right, which is what alt-C policy is.
Right, exactly. With Psycha, I guess, with Ambient, we got to redefine it or continue to use the target ref and the layer we have.
So I spent some time coming back to the implementation complexity discussion that John was having. So we're having two in-depth conversations at once. Like, what should our policy posture? What should our kind of stake in the ground about what's the best possible long-term outcome and how we're going to work towards it? That's a pretty big discussion in and of itself. Like as Costin mentioned, like does Z tunnel become a CNI? Right, that could happen. How do we compose? Does the network policy API in Kubernetes need to evolve to allow more than one implementer to coexist? Right, that time, like that has happened for Gateway. And then, is it too hard to implement workload policy in the waypoint? Right, and like what are we doing for existing user transitions moving away from the sidecar model? Those are kind of those are things that have to align in the law, but they have very different kind of decision-making structures around. And John brought up some points. There's some implementation complexity issues. There are some issues with also being entirely service-centric, right? When we talk about stateful sets, right, which we have to work through. While stateful sets are rare, they are still important enough that they show up. And there is no VIP for a stateful set, right? There's no well-defined capture point for a proxy, right? You end up either being a forwarding proxy, right, or you are going to the workload, right? And so, do we say you can't have L7 policies? There's all these kinds of implications. I guess my question right now is which of these two topics does the group want to spend the next 30 minutes beating their head against? Because we're not going to get through both of them in 30 minutes.
Just one point I want to make is that we should focus on API and what the user experience is, and what is the easiest and simplest experience that users will understand, and because we cannot force people to stop using network policy, we cannot, and the ideal scenario will be APIs that are agreed by multiple vendors and that evolve. Not all vendors will support them, but some of them will. Just like with Gateway, with the extension mechanism that is used in gateways, where again some extensions are optional, and as long as we can agree, it's not Istio specific API and Istio only API, I think we can have a path forward. But I'm very worried that we continue to try to fit the entire world around Istio and assume that everyone will use Istio when probably it's not going to happen.
Austin, I really like that
then
we should be focusing on the end user experience. To that end, I have a question, and this might show some of my ignorance with how Ambient works today. But the stateful set problem in Gamma, HTTP routes are attached to services, not to gateways. So how does Gamma serve stateful sets today?
If I recall correctly,
you would have
the spec says something not attached to. Now in ECO, we do have a way to do it, but it's kind of it's not a perfect way because we map on traffic to the pods, but we have absolutely no way to know if they called the service and it resolved to a pod or they just called the pod directly. So it's a little bit wonky because those are literally the same thing on the network, right? Because there's no VIP. That's how we implement it. I don't know if we do it for Gamma properly to not implement it like the spec says, but the spec kind of leaves it out. They basically say there needs to be a front end. So in most cases, that's the cluster IP. But in theory, it could be something else.
Right. The only way any proxy can implement policy for something like a stateful set is to act as a pure forwarding proxy, right? In principle, right? The client has to tell it which endpoint it's going to talk to. So you have to agree to talk to it, or not, right? But that's basically what I'm getting. Because that's what stateful sets are. Like the client chooses one of the stateful endpoints, and that choice has to be respected end to end. Right. So that's what we do today in Waypoint. Right. We act as a forwarding proxy. Right. Traffic goes to the waypoint from the Z-tunnel. The Z-tunnel says, "I'm trying to talk to this pod," and Z-tunnel agrees to talk to it, more or less. It just so happens that that works for any type of workload addressing. The problem is, as John mentioned, knowing what pod they're trying to talk to, right, isn't necessarily or ideally all the information that we want. Now, it is enough information to know what authorization policy to implement when the authorization policy is attached, because we maintain a map to set up auth policies and then materialize that inside the waypoint. And that's what happens, right? There has to be something that takes destination IP and maps it into an auth policy based on some matching criteria, and then implement the check. Right? That's the thing that mimics the behavior of a cipher. Right? Is the ability to map back in waypoint for all the current workloads in the namespace. And that, probably from an ISTOD standpoint, a control plane standpoint, is not an overly complex task. Do far more complicated things than an ISTOD, but it is complexity, and it does. I can see why for some vendors it presents implementation challenges when they want to use some other piece of infrastructure. John, right? Some use cases I'm not aware of. So the question is, right, this is just a pure implementation complexity question. Right, the reason why we use workload selectors in auth policy is to avoid the unintended consequence of, or lack of transparency in authorization policy enforcement for access. Right, you need to be able to reason about the attachment of policies to workloads and not just services to ensure that they're always enforced, because services can be changed without workloads being changed. And that happens, right? I mean, DNS poisoning attacks happen. There are various forms of this type of attack, right? And
I'm not 100% sure I agree with that. I mean, it's a fairly common practice to do some authorization checks at the ingress gateway, and then verify that traffic went through the ingress gateway, right? So if we have a waypoint.
In a world of DMZs, I would agree, John. But in a world of heterogeneous corporate networks, I do disagree. Right, and we've seen that, right, and it's kind of being talked about in the security community a bit too, right? Like on the audit side. But how do I know what auth policies are being implemented for a workload? if you can guarantee a DMZ, right, which is what an ingress gateway is, like the outside network can't talk directly to the internal network, then you can use the service abstraction to represent the security boundary. If you guarantee there are no other ways of getting there.
Louis, I would have to disagree.
In heterogeneous corporate environments,
the fundamental problem is with DMZ is that you trust implicitly that that gateway is in front of you and it's towards the policy. But we are not doing this. We even with
not implicitly, explicitly.
Explicitly means that yes,
you're relying on it.
Yes, explicitly means that you have a network policy or L4 policies that say only thing that can talk with me is a policy enforcement point, be it a waypoint, be it a ingress gateway, being whatever it is, as long as you have a chain of custody and you know exactly that the policy is going to the point, you are good. And it's equivalent with what we are doing with Ambient, where Ambient does have an ingress gateway in front of the workloads.
So
we just
zTunnel does let us enforce a structural guarantee for stuff in Kubernetes right now. We still have to think about, right, and we're going to have to look at this, right, for VMs and other things. Right, so we have to be like we certainly didn't have a structural guarantee before with Sidecar, right? We had none.
Yep.
Now we have something that looks a bit like a CNI and allows us to get some form of structural guarantee. So I agree there's some flexibility here, but I just want to be careful about thinking about the security posture, right? Services come and go. We don't want in general users writing policies of traffic to service, allow deny. Right? If there's any ambiguity about whether there are two services running the same backend, causing misapplication or over application of authorization policy, we don't want that property because that's dangerous, right? And we've seen that be dangerous in the past.
I think one thing on ingress, delegating the authorization to ingress, it does have a pretty fatal flaw that in theory someone in a different namespace could create some route that doesn't have the policy and then route it to your service, right? And it's the same shared identity. That's not really something we'll have in waypoints probably because they'll be tied to the namespace. So it is a little bit better than ingress in that regard.
Yes, I think we offer the structural mechanism to get the guarantee. The problem is then like people foot gunning. Right. Usually the problem with Aussie policy is not able to meet the criteria. Is it easy or hard to foot gun yourself? Think about how you should apply policies in a way that leads you down a dangerous path. Right. And that happens a lot, by the way. Right, which is why people spend lots and lots of money on auditing tools to go look at their networks and like try to figure out if they foot gun themselves. We'd rather not, right? We'd try to provide structural guarantees and define APIs that make it harder to do it. Right, workload attachment really does help people understand their security posture. But like with zTunnel Waypoint, we do have a structural guarantee, but it can still lead people to write policies in a dangerous way.
Hey, I just want to remind everybody we have 20 minutes left. Well, should we spend our 20 minutes discuss the most important thing? I'm thinking, Louis and Carsten, you guys mentioned, what is the desired user behavior and resources? That's probably the most important thing without thinking about how we need to implement it. Do you guys agree? Because this is like trigger big change in ambient. Do we need to do it? I think we need to kind of agree on what is the desired user experience for this, or if we are changing anything.
So, I mean, I think compromise is endemic here because of upgrade, right? And our ability to enact immediate change on Kubernetes network policy, right? So there are some compromises that have to be made here, right? Like we have a desired state that is unachievable Like we would network policy to have class, right? So you could say which implementation of it you wanted to use. That's not going to happen in a meaningful time frame. So we can't depend on it. I think the primary choice to make is the question John asked, right? Which is, look, can we or can we not do workload-oriented policies in Waypoint? If we just can't do it, right, which is a technical question, then that's going to have some downstream impact on the API. If you come at it from the other direction and say, look, this we want the API to be, I guess we could come at that way. So that's a question about what should authorization policy say and do, and how should it be interpreted? John, I mean, just, is it infeasible?
I mean, it's clearly not infeasible. We've done it in the current Istio, and we have a lot of issues with it that have popped up and continue to pop up. The design is not efficient. We could possibly change Envoy to make it efficient. I think it's infeasible to say that we can ever stick something that's not an Istio configured Envoy with our custom filters and whatnot that we've created to be a waypoint, right? Like there is a waypoint as a service is really a gateway, right? Like it's not a huge stretch to say you could put any off-the-shelf gateway implementation and have it be a waypoint if it's a service. In the current design of waypoint, it looks like gateway, but it's nowhere near in terms of implementation, right?
Okay, so maybe that's a good question. How many people here or elsewhere needs to be able to use a gateway other than the one that we currently ship in Istio as a waypoint?
I do.
So I got one crab for John.
What do you mean? Using a global load balancer, using internal load balancer?
Well, some proxy that is not literally the Istio waypoint implementation and controller.
Anyone who doesn't have a single region, they need a global load balancer.
All right, so we got Keith. Was that you too, Mitch? You had a vote. All right.
Yeah.
So if three people
Service
say they want to be able
service injection is kind of the way that I think of Waypoint. If there are services that we don't provide, you ought to be able to do transparent service injection of other services into the flow with their own APIs, their own configuration, but the injection being managed through Istio and the Z-tunnel.
Okay, so we have 3 votes for, I need to be able to use something else other than Istio's waypoint as the waypoint. Roughly, right? I don't want to get into VNS and virtual network functions and all that madness, but like roughly. Okay. Because that's an important thing for the community to understand, right? Is, hey, we need to be able to use something else. Right, and those things will come with their own limitations, right? Right, they may offer less features, fewer features. That should not be a limitation on Istio as to what Istio offers, right? There should be a well-defined contract with those things that say, hey, I want to be bumped in the wild for the waypoint use case. Great. Here's the contractual integration point. Here's how that integration works. Implement features at your will. But those features don't necessarily impinge the implementation choices Istio makes for its waypoint. Fair?
I would say yes, but the contract is important. So like
sure, yeah,
one doing service-based and one doing workload-based, that seems hard to classify as the same thing. But various differences in what exactly supported, absolutely. We need to spec that out.
If you're an Istio open source user and you were going to move to a vendor provided that did not do that, you would probably have questions for your vendor. Right, but Istio can't control what the vendor do.
Well, the whole point is that those other implementations are, by definition, the value is they do something different than what Istio does today. So we can't define all of that.
Right, and they're allowed to do less. Right, let's be clear. Like, there's no compatibility guarantee. other than the structural guarantee of we will send you the traffic with this construct, right? Just like we do for integrating with CA, as Gustav mentioned.
I think for me it's a little bit different than compatibility guarantee, and more of going back to the workload question, right? Like you mentioned, Lou, like it seems like that's part of the core problem statement is workload versus service-based policy. Can we even say that waypoints implement workload policy to, well, I guess we can, like a per namespace, but the policies themselves aren't bound to workloads really anymore. Like everything about waypoint, it looks kind of like a gateway, talks kind of like a gateway, but it's not a gateway because we're still holding on to this workload construct. And even, there's only so much that any project's going to be able to do when it comes to compatibility. So I don't know, even though that, I personally, with the users that I see, need for compatibility. For me, it's more of that inherent architectural posture of why not just lean in and make Waypoint a gateway? I think that's probably the most compelling piece of all this for me.
And nobody's saying that Waypoint isn't a gateway, right? Waypoint is a forward proxy, right? So like the Z tunnel, which is the client, tells it, I want to talk to this pod. And you could write a policy against that, right? The only difference being, like if I write an auth Z policy as on the forward proxy, so the client is trying to talk to this pod, right? The thing I'll see in the traffic is an IP. I could write a policy against the IP, and that would give me a workload-oriented policy. Right?
That's the difference. The backends for gateways are services. The backends for waypoints.
No, people traditionally think of the front ends for gateways as services, but that's not always true. Sometimes they're forward proxies. The backends for gateways are workloads.
So front ends, backends are backends. Yes, front ends have IPs and VIPs and whatever they have, and they're distinguished. When you write policies for the VIPs or you write policies for the actual IPs, backend IPs, they are very different things, and we are mixing them together. That's a problem here, that we are confusing VIPs with IPs.
Well, so the only thing we're saying is, like there are clearly situations where we need waypoints to act as a forward proxy. Like just like we need gateway to act as a forward proxy. Like you can absolutely use the gateway API outside of Istio to set up a forward proxy. And there's no way that that's not going to be a common use case. Right? The only convenience we provide today is a mapping between a label selector and an IP to identify an authorization policy to apply to a specific piece of traffic. That's it. And we maintain that map. Now we can either decide to not maintain that map for the user, to make that map maintenance easier, or to get rid of it. Right, but they could certainly write it manually. Like I'd write an auth Z policy where destination IP is the IP of the pod, implement this auth Z policy on a forward proxy port, and it would work. And like if the gateway API ever got an L7 authorization policy, it would work there too. Right?
Yeah, nobody likes that.
That's a whole other discussion, right? And maybe that's part of the long-term API discussion. But I just want the only thing we're talking about is workload label set mapping to IPs in Envoy. That's the feature Waypoint has to implement. Or sorry, that's the feature Istio has to implement to support workload policy selection for any piece of traffic.
Or not implement and defer to other solutions and focus, kind of keep things separated. I mean, you have one solution for services and VIPs, one solution for pods and ephemeral addresses. I mean, that's there is no reason to combine them. We are forced combining them because both are policies, which are very different.
It's really hard to write L7 policies for stateful sets today, so it was actually a useful feature that we provided. I don't want to say that
there's another solution for that. I mean, you can
no,
use
so value of corner case versus the cost of maintenance. Like that's really all we're talking about here. Like I was talking, like John and I chatted a bit about this, and I suggested like zTunnel could say when it talks to the waypoint, this is who I'm trying to talk to, including all of the labels, because it knows the metadata, right? It actually has the baggage, right? We were using that. It could pass it, right? And you could just implement the label selector and envoy, and it would work, right? It would get the same behavior that we have today, and it would route based on original destination, like a typical forward proxy. Right, so there are ways of changing the dynamics of the complexity in the control plane. Right, by making some choices in the structural layer below it, which we are allowed to do because we control it and we're dependent on it anyway to guarantee that traffic goes through the waypoint, right? Which is that's one of the fundamental guarantees of zTunnel. I just want to point out, like, there are solutions to the implementation complexity problem that are orthogonal to the I need to have a different waypoint implementation. And I don't want to couple those two things, because if we're going to design for allowing other waypoints, those other waypoints are going to have their own APIs doing God knows what, and Istio can't be responsible for them, right? So we can't overly couple. We just need to define a contract. And then we can see if within the scope of that contract that allows Istio's waypoint to do certain things or not. Right, because it's going to be bound by the limitations of that contract to be fair to the other implementations. Right, so do we need forward proxy support? I would strongly argue that we do because of cluster local. And the reason why other waypoint implementations, like let's say you want to go and implement IPS or deep packet inspection stuff, right, being a bump in the wire. You're absolutely going to want that for stateful set. You're going to want coverage. So not thinking about any company here, Mitch, but your company's in that business. I can't imagine that the contract not covering that would be sufficient for your use case.
Yeah. One other data point there, in trying to find users to provide feedback for Ambient, I did touch base with Salesforce, and I heard that they suspect Ambient will not be something that they can adopt broadly internally because they are so reliant in sidecar mode on the client side proxying, which I think is what you're talking about, the forward proxying, Louis. So that's only one data point.
Probably, I'm going to question that a little bit, but not for the reason that you mentioned. When they said client-side proxying, what they probably thought that they meant was client-side load balancing.
That's a possibility. I'd have to go look at the conversation to be sure.
Yeah, I would actually like to go and follow up on that conversation if you could loop me in, because it's important.
Will do.
So just coming back to the basic question, right? If we're going to use waypoint as an integration point for third-party solutions, do we have to cover forward proxy or not? It's pretty fundamental. And with no restriction on what policy is being implemented by that waypoint choice or not, right? We can't, Istio is not going to prescribe. So it's going to be like, you're going to have a gateway class, which is like aviatrix waypoint. And all that will tell Istio is, hey, zTunnels, send it to the aviatrix waypoint instead of an Istio waypoint, right? And there's some contract for how that works. And we don't, Istio knows nothing about what's implemented inside it. I think that's what the contract has to look like.
Yeah,
I think that has to cover all types of traffic. So everything
that's right.
going into the scope covered by the waypoint, not just services.
Yeah.
John, Keith, you were the other two crabs.
Yeah, I mean, we don't even necessarily need the zTunnel layer to know that it's a gateway, right? We can assign new services and new DNS names and new VIPs and really just make them standard gateway objects. And we can ease the migration by using something like external name to provide an alias if we want the same, cluster.local names. But there doesn't necessarily even need to be any magic. You can do almost all of what we're talking about today, sans the fact that you probably don't have the secure network and identity propagation and whatnot between all the different hops. But you can go set up an internal load balancer today in Kubernetes, of course, right?
The one thing I would suggest that we do in Istio is recommend, if you're going to bring your own waypoint implementation, that you do meet certain security integration requirements with zTunnel. Right? We don't really want to recommend like the Wild West in terms of security. Now, how to go about that, like that's another conversation, but which, those ideas have come up before. Yeah, so like I have an idea in my head about how we might, like from an API standpoint, automate such an integration. You're right, like from a networking, like, hey, VIPs and endpoints construct, yeah, we can do stuff, but I think we also want something that users can kind of introspect. But we don't have to go into the weeds on that. But I would think it's a very good idea to say zTunnel should know when it's talking to one of these things, if or if not, if it's going to talk HBone to it. And we would strongly prefer that we talk to HBone to it.
Yeah, I would imagine some higher level API that then spits out standard gateway API objects.
Yes.
And I would say it doesn't necessarily need to be HBone. It could just be standard mutual TLS with DNS certificates as well.
Sure, like something that we could reasonably implement in zTunnel and be able to make some of the basic same zero trust assertions about. Like that waypoint is in that namespace. Like we'd probably like to know that.
Yeah.
But on a more pragmatic and
So
practical, sorry, Louis, to interrupt.
Okay.
On a practical term, I mean, we want to, try to move Ambient forward and we don't have to ship everything at once. So I understand enforcing workload policies in Waypoint, we don't yet know the perfect solution, perfect API. We are not in perfect consensus, but for service enforcement, I don't think there is any doubt or any particular objection, we are in pretty solid ground on enforcing service policies. Would it be possible to move forward with, zTunnel plus service policies in Waypoint's Gate or whatever, and defer to a future version the workloads? We don't have to ship everything at once or solve all the problems at once. We can keep using sidecars for a while. And that would give us, more focus on, more wood, fewer arrows, if you want to use that quote.
So I'm always okay with the idea of deferring. Like we don't have to implement everything, right? But we should reserve the right to implement that, right? I don't want to like structurally remove the ability to do it, right? So that's saying like Waypoint has to be able to act as a forward proxy. It's optional whether when acting as a forward proxy you can implement workload Alt-Z policy, right? Is that a fair summary, Custom? Okay. So zTunnel still needs to know, hey, I'm trying to talk to a pod. I'm going to send traffic through the Waypoint. It just might not implement any Alt-Z policy on it, right? Or at least it has to be able to do that.
Or it declares that, with services we are, beta, GA, anyone can use it for service use cases. And the others are still in progress. We are still iterating. Please don't use it in production because we may change implementation details or whatever. But it's not black and white, and we need to solve all the workload problems in order to ship service.
Sure. Yeah. No, like that part, like that compromise is reasonable to me. So we maintain this structural topological guarantee, but we relax what is currently described as the implemented set of APIs for all traffic patterns. Right, so we maintain that like one of the fundamental structural guarantees is like all traffic into the namespace or service account must go through that namespace or service account's waypoint. We don't say what happens, but it must.
For services, for sure. For individual
if we don't say that up front, we're not going to meet. No, like Mitch's requirement, right, and anybody else's. Right, and also, by the way, if I'm acting as a forward proxy, I can implement gateway-style authorization policies as a forward proxy, right? We could describe what that would look like. right? So there's the structural,
Things that are risky, yes.
right? So
But-
there's structural traffic guarantees, right? Which like the Lego bricks of ambient. And then what policies get implemented? We keep those two decisions separate, but we still say all traffic, like the Lego brick, all traffic going to workloads must go through the waypoint.
But that is what is causing those all hairpinning problems, because we are saying, I mean, to make this guaranteed means that all clients use Istio or have a way to redirect to traffic to a particular pod to route it via that.
Well, no, remember, like we only get the structural guarantee where Z-tunnel is in place. That's the only
that's
place
fine.
that we get. Okay, so we can.
If we keep
Right.
it, if Z-tunnel is in
Right.
place, we get the structural guarantee. If Z-tunnel is not, we don't. Then it's perfectly feasible. We don't have
Right.
hairpinning.
Right, those are all like separate decisions. But like when Z-tunnel is in place, I think we have to have that as a Lego brick. Otherwise, the system is too hard to reason about. Like the hairpinning problem, right, which is a different use case, is like stuff coming from not Z-tunnel trying to get into something. And our answers there are hairpin it, block it, tell every user they must go through a gateway. Right? Which we could go and look at again if we wanted to, like if that's getting too complicated. But I don't want to complicate the typical use case for that use case either. It doesn't seem like a good design trade-off. And Istio could say, look, we don't do hairpinning. It's too complicated. Go through a gateway. And a vendor could go and do, yeah, we do a hairpinning. We do all this crazy stuff, right? Have at it. But Istio says, no, we're going to keep it pretty straightforward and simple. Like that's a valid thing to do again, right? Doesn't change any of the structural traffic guarantees.
Hey, it seems like we talked about 2 or 3 different threads in the call. Would it be possible to quickly summarize sort of which are the 3 odd threads of discussion in this area? Because it seems like we were sort of going across multiple threads of topics under auth.
Yeah, so I think there's a kind of the Lego bricks of ambient, right? Is there a structural guarantee that waypoint as a definition means all traffic into service account or namespace, i.e. the waypoint scope, must go through the waypoint, regardless of what the waypoint actually implements in terms of policy, right? So it's the contract between the L7 layer and the L4 layer. Because if we're going to redefine that, right, that has some pretty sweeping implications. Then there's what policy should Istio's waypoint implement, right, for those different types of traffic. Which choices can be made about. Those choices are, and similarly for the hairpinning use case, right, for traffic coming from outside the mesh, right, which means traffic that's not H-bone based on identity that we know and share. What should we do, right? And that's a similar type of choice for number 2, right? How much complexity do we want in Istio? And then obviously number 1 impacts any vendor who wants to provide their own waypoint implementation. And vendors are going to have different feelings about what traffic they do or don't want to see, or like, but Istio knows nothing about what policies a vendor can implement. So it has no opinion about what policy is implemented in that waypoint, in a vended waypoint. Don't care. It's the vendor's problem. And then there's an implementation detail question, which is really the sub-question of number 2, which is implementing workload policy too complex for Istio? Is that a fair summary, everybody?
I feel like there's a little bit more, but I'll probably need to think about it and maybe add comments later. I feel like there's more.
Well, yeah. Well, I guess there's all this stuff about like API evolution, right? So should Istio adopt network policy as an L4 only API and recommend its use? And sub question there, how do we prevent conflict with the existing CNI? Right. And
Also,
do
I feel like even if we assume that Istio L4 will stay separate from CNI/Kubernetes L4, and let's for now assume that these will remain separate APIs, and it's okay to have to provision twice.
Yes.
But
which is what keeps change is, right? Effectively.
Right. Even going with that assumption for now, it's not clear to me that the current L4 options within Istio are adequate, because one of the value of Ambient is now we've made it applicable to all protocols, right, including like UDP and things like that. And from a quick look, it seemed to me like we might need some more rules and filters, given the fact that we are transporting a broader set of protocols now than previously with Sidecar Mesh, which was essentially TCP. So we might need to think about that a little bit more. So even assuming that Istio L4 is separate from CNI L4 permanently, I think we should think a bit more about it.
Oh, sure. I think there's definitely questions about like how the policy API should evolve as Istio becomes more capable and supports more protocols. Like that, I think that's been a forever topic. But yes, that's now getting more pressing.
Yeah.
I just want to because the forward proxy thing is important, right? Does anybody think that waypoints should not be able to act as forward proxies for workloads? Is that you, John, or is that just a fat finger?
Yeah, that's me. I'm not convinced that it's a use case we need to support.
You think it is?
No, I'm not convinced that it's a use case we need to support. I think we could get away with only services.
Okay. So we need to resolve on stateful set.
Stateful set, yes, but that doesn't involve workload to workload. So it's a narrow case, and I think it's more nuanced. It is a use case, but it doesn't have to be coupled or shipped at the same time or implemented with the same solution. I mean, we can use a different solution for one of the others. And sidecars is a valid solution for workload to workload.
Well, remember that doesn't help Mitch, right? We have to be like, if we're going to offer a standardized vendor integration point, we have to be very clear what it means. We can't be fuzzy on it, right?
Cool. But we can be very clear. This is an integration point for services, and a different integration point will be provided for workload to workload. It doesn't have to be exactly the same integration point. For CAs, we provide multiple integration points. We provide, so it's fine to have multiple solutions for each problem to pick the right solution.
Well, what Mitch wants to do is to put something between the traffic, between the client and the server. He doesn't care whether it's a service or a workload.
The idea of doing it
these two different solutions, it doesn't have to be, I mean, yes, you may want a lot of things, but sometimes you get what you need, not what you want.
Well, if you're going to offer a security product, which I'm not going to speak for Mitch, but they probably do, then it's a problem if there's ambiguity. Like, I don't think it's a good idea for ambiguity question. So like I'm going to push back a little bit on this to at least get the point. Like if we're to say like this is for vendors and this is like that we are very clear, right? If it varies by like I don't want to say well go use sidecars. Like I'm okay saying like they only get this with ambient. That's fine, right? The vendor integration point. Like I don't have a problem with that, but I do have a problem with lack of clarity.
Interestingly, that inbound part of sidecar is probably the least problematic part of sidecar.
Yes,
so
no,
when we're talking about like policies, like you could probably have a perfectly reasonable system with having a few sidecars that are inbound only. Really, all the problems are from the outbound aspect of it.
Right. Well, I mean, there's the other problem, like the operational side of sidecars, right?
Yeah, that's kind of being fixed though. Like, yes, there are issues, but if it's like for your L7 stateful workloads only for a few pods, that doesn't concern me too much. If you then say I want everything to have policies, maybe that's concerning.
I don't know if you're going to get away with that argument operationally. Like, I get technically, but like, okay, you've got a stateful set, you have to run sidecars. You don't have a stateful set, you can just use regular ambient. Like, that's
it's not just stateful set though. It's L7 stateful set that I want to apply L7 policies to.
Sure.
That's pretty niche, it feels like.
So we could say, look, there's no waypoint mechanism for workloads. Alt-Z policy only works at L4. Services are only L7. Right? I don't know if that gets us where we need to be.
Well, when we say L7, what we really mean is HTTP plain text where we can do man in the middle and all the other stuff. Any application doing L7 with HTTPS, it's completely out of scope.
Oh, yeah, no. That's L4. Right.
But it's L7. Yes. It's L7.
No. Really. So any protocol where we have a proxy implementation can parse it and understand the operations and commands within it. Not just HTTP, but it's the most common one. Like I'm fine with that definition. Right, that's what we do today. Like we can't do anything other than that.
Yeah, I'd be worried though if we're saying like, you know, I don't want this edge case to make the experience worse for all the other cases when there's already a solution for that edge case too. Like the fact that someone may want to apply L7 policies to L7 stateful sets and they don't like sidecars isn't compelling enough for me to sway the design of the entire system. Like they have a solution. It's one that's used in production by thousands of companies today. It's a decent solution. Sidecars aren't terrible. I'm perfectly fine with them using those for those niche cases and making sure that the other 99.9% of cases are optimal.
I don't think
I don't want to get hung up trying to solve every problem.
Everybody is going to agree with you on like that solution is fine, right? When the operational burden of sidecars is problematic, right? The maintenance, upgrade, CVE patching, right? Which is one of the big motivators in Ambient, still holds.
Sure, but at what expense? Like now they're saying that the whole ambient architecture is kind of regressed only to solve those cases. It feels like a very high cost, right?
Well, like we could say, look, there is no workload aware authorization policy implemented in the waypoint. The waypoint can act as a forwarding proxy, right? Just a pass through forwarding proxy. So you can get L7 telemetry, which is one of the big values of waypoint, right? Generically. Right, and we could say it's just relax the constraint on the Alt-Z policy, right?
What value do we get by sending it through the waypoint? We just get L7 telemetry observability.
Yeah, which is a big deal.
It's not such a big deal. I mean, nowadays L7. I mean, having instrumentation done in the application to open telemetry, it's becoming more and more common. How many applications do not use Java or Go, or one of the languages that can be auto-instrumented by agents, or link a small library?
The difficulty there is consistency, Austin. If you're in a polyglot environment, you've got your Golang version of telemetry and your Java version of telemetry, maybe your .NET version of telemetry. Having that consistent layer 7 telemetry across the board is actually one of the major adoption pushes for service.
And that's why OpenTelemetry
Yeah,
is standardizing that across languages.
No. Costin, we know that the rollout of OpenTelemetry in real enterprises consistently is not what you would need it to be. Like, one of our primary value adds is like, yes, you can get yourself to 60% or 40% on telemetry by updating your apps. You're never getting yourself to 100%. And 100% is where you get the actual operational value. Then you can do audit.
And we know that some people don't upgrade 100% of user workloads to use say sidecars because they're in the same situation.
Sure, right, but like, we've been spending the last 7 years trying to persuade people to do that, right? Like I think that's just like a hard no, right? Like, we sell the value proposition of consistent golden signals.
Yes.
Regardless of what you did.
And that's what other people are doing as well. And again, there are other kind of gateways that generate telemetry. There are other solutions that generate telemetry. The right solution is to, have across
Istio,
industry standards, not Istio only.
Right,
standards.
which is why Istio integrates with OTel, right? But we make you send the traffic through our infrastructure to get it, just like any other gateway would.
Yeah, but if we're saying,
like, what we offer the way to get as much traffic as possible through a gateway to get as much observability as you could get, more than you would get with any other type of solution today.
I strongly disagree with this statement. You get a minimum amount of telemetry that you can only sniff through plain text HTTP. With a native integration, you get full telemetry, including your own application telemetry, garbage collections, everything that you care about in your application, including HTTPS traffic, if the application is doing native HTTPS, and standardized across all the components in the entire, doesn't matter what gateway you use, doesn't matter what you use.
Costin, I would agree if people were maintaining their software like that. They are not.
They're starting to.
Call me again in 10 years. I'm with that one. John.
I think if our real goal is to say that you get, L7 telemetry everywhere, though, only putting it through the waypoint is actually a huge blocker, because there's a huge cost to the waypoint, right? It breaks compatibility with applications. It has a huge latency and cost. It's operationally expensive. It may not be as complex as a sidecar, but you have to pay for the compute. You send all traffic there, you parse it. If we really just wanted 100% L7 traffic, it can be done like through the node, right? There's already existing solutions out there. Cilium, Pixie, we could easily do it. Well, not easily, but you do it in zTunnel as well to get L7 telemetry without going through a waypoint as well.
Right, but so far we've made the choice not, like, we're making implementation choices for Istio, right? The telemetry solution that we have today is Envoy.
Sure.
Sure. Yeah.
Right, and there are other things, like I just mentioned telemetry. Like, you could do jot token validation on opaquely forwarded traffic, right? And still not implement workload specific OLT policy, right? There are lots of other things that we have that can work just fine on like transparent or forward proxy mode. There's a long list of them. Quotas, rate limits, right? Circuit breaking, timeouts, retries.
The Aperture product we just saw shown at IstioCon, was it yesterday or the day before? As I understand it, would require the forward proxy functionality. I mean, they run today and just by creating their own sidecar. So of course they could continue doing that. But I think the idea behind all of this is that we can move not just Istio forward, but the ecosystem.
So I'm okay loosening the semantics of Z policy. I'm just not okay giving up on all the other L7 features that we can perfectly adequately apply to L7 forward proxy traffic. And if people want to bypass it and do stuff at L4, we already offer the capability to do that. Why would we roll everything back? When the complaint is mostly about all Z policy, which okay, that's fine, relax that. Right, standard telemetry is just one example of value. We have lots of other things that apply equally well.
Are those value that needs to be had for traffic that's not going to a service, which is a huge niche of traffic? Right? The majority of traffic goes through a service. We don't even support traffic not to a service in client sidecars today. So it seems quite unlikely that there's a large portion of non-service traffic in a mesh, excluding stateful sets.
Well, I'm not trying to, like, stateful sets are the canonical example, right?
If the only issue then is stateful sets, maybe we have a targeted solution towards stateful sets to fill the gap.
What would that look like?
It could say for stateful sets, you have a workload-oriented waypoint or something where we enable this mode or something along those lines. Like we don't need to, why do we need to accept traffic directly to pods through waypoints for 100% of pods when only a small portion of them actually will ever receive traffic like that or should ever receive traffic like that?
So reasonable discussion to be had is the operational complexity of the trade-off between a different operational model for stateful sets versus the complexity in waypoints with the relaxation of workloads-based policy selectors.
Yeah, we have to work through that for sure.
Right, like my instinct and based on what I've seen would say, no, it's not worth that trade-off. Because all the other stuff works just fine, doesn't add a ton of complexity.
Going back to your thing, Mitch, I didn't catch the talk, but I'm looking through the slides now. I don't actually think what I'm proposing it breaks that model because presumably they're receiving traffic to workloads through service, right? It's only in the case of stateful sets that we want to have L7 policy application. And we could find other ways to do that.
I'll admit that I'm a little bit confused by the statement that it's only through stateful sets. Forward proxy gathers client-side layer 7 telemetry, like the existing model where we have a proxy on each side, a forward and a reverse proxy effectively. I'm a bit confused how it would only apply to traffic headed towards stateful sets. That sounds like a reverse proxy to me.
Perhaps I'm misunderstanding what was being discussed.
Stateful sets are forward proxy, Mitch. They have to be, right? Because the client chooses the physical destination.
Okay.
I think to put it another way, what we're talking about is whether the waypoint will accept traffic to a specific IP and then send it to that IP, like a original desk type thing.
Right. Like,
but it's still
will it trust a Z tunnel that sent its traffic and act as a forward proxy on its behalf? And then how do you write policy against that use case?
But strictly restricted for cases where clients have Z tunnels. So well, Z tunnel is deployed everywhere.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, no, I do agree with that, Costin. I completely agree with that.
So that means waypoint hairpinning is gone. So there is no hairpinning use case or scenario where hairpinning will be needed. All clients have Z tunnel, no problem, no hairpinning. A client doesn't have Z tunnel, not in scope, not a problem, no need for hairpinning there.
I think we covered it, right? Like we can deal with hairpinning completely separate from this topic.
So it's the summary, essentially, that if stateful sets is required, then we need workload-oriented waypoints. If we can either elide stateful sets from support or come up with something specific for stateful sets, then we can align with service-oriented policy, which from where I'm sitting seems to be the current direction of Gateway API. We just talked about this in the last API meeting, that there is no immediate future for any sort of workload policy. Kubernetes doesn't really have that concept. Everything on the network is like go through service. It is the service representation of a workload.
At L7, at L4, it absolutely does, right? Network policy is a workload-oriented policy.
Right, you select the labels in the Cilium network policy, right, based on your workload label.
Sure, right, yeah. At L7, sure. There's nothing you can do there for arbitrary policy, sure. Yeah, I don't know. The more John pulls on that thread, like how many, if we can have alignment with Gateway API stack, with Kubernetes, et cetera, L7 stateful sets does feel sort of niche to me. I don't know. I guess, yeah, writing L7 policy against stateful sets as a forward proxy feels sort of weird because you're not going through service.
Well, no, like forward proxies are widely used in the industry, even in Kubernetes. Widely. Even at ingress gateways, people use forward proxies, right? The only thing that they might use to select the destination may be opaque to the client, but the client has still got a token, which is an encrypted form of the IP address of the destination, right? That's often what is done in session cookies, right? So these are not niche things, right? Like that we are not going to get hit with. Like every gaming company on the planet, when they put you in a game, they send a cookie out to the client. That cookie basically has the address of the physical proxy server for the game room in the backend. It hits the edge proxy, they decode it, and they forward it.
But that persistent stationary. I mean, that's already covered. It's a different API.
Sure, no, but the only difference, Costin, in terms of implementation is the encoding of the destination address and how policy is written against it.
And the fact this is a standard that is well defined, broadly used, and so forth, and very different from stateful.
Well, no. There's no standard for that custom. Right? It is widely used in industry practice. There is no standard for it. We want to be clear. Forward proxying is also widely used in network bridging.
I don't know what.
And in enterprise stuff like Kafka, right? Forward proxying is used all the time. The Cosmo, the Microsoft Azure database, right? MySQL clients use forward proxying. Like forward proxying is not that rare. Like it's not nearly as common as services. Like I agree with that. Like it's 100 to 1, but that 1 is still really important, right? Because they're often like critical storage or backend or caching systems. Right? They have high availability requirements. Like they're fundamental things that people build on top of.
Yeah, but supporting those it doesn't mean that we should send traffic through the waypoint for other things that aren't stateful. Like I have no problem if we need to say we want a mode where you can send stateful set traffic through the waypoint and do some things with it. So like, I do have a problem with that, implying that we need to make a structural guarantee that all traffic goes through the waypoint.
Okay, I think that's an okay conversation to have. Like, so we need to get into the weeds on that one. I'm not totally comfortable with the idea of, hey, end user, you have a different operational model. Like, that's really painful. Like we can have different API models, but different operational models, that's bad. Like we should try and avoid that like the plague. Because we know operational complexity is like a force multiplier on like how operators perceive the system. Like we could say like stateful sets, L4 only. Okay, like that's an API, but it doesn't change the operational model of the system as far as the user perceives it. It's a capability. It's not I have to deploy something different. Like that gets us in so much trouble. And we've done a lot of work to try and stop doing as much of that as possible. All right, so
I think we are already well past the time, so maybe probably don't want to drag the discussion any further. But I feel like were we equating forward proxy with the need to have workload-based policies? Like it seems like firstly, whether treating all policies as applying only to services versus to services and workloads should be perhaps independent of whether we support forward proxy behavior or not. Maybe I'm being naive on that. I feel like these
I think those are independent choices we can make.
Right. And then secondly,
Absolutely.
for non-Kub, this whole discussion about stateful sets and so on, that's in the context of Kubernetes workloads. But with VM-based workloads or maybe some future, I don't know, WASM-based workloads or whatever, there could be things that are not modeled as services, right? And you would need more of direct workload, traffic sent directly to workloads, and hence policies applied there. So it wasn't clear to me that everything can be modeled as a service except if it's a stateful set.
Yeah, I think stateful sets are the kind of leading example. If we can figure out, like, make a decision for them, then we can probably extrapolate to the other use cases. We have a bit more information about a stateful set than we might have about just bare IP. But I suspect some of the other stuff will fall out, but yeah, we should track it.
And one last thing about the CNI discussion. So I think the history with the CNI network policy was they did talk about initially there was discussion about having services-based Kubernetes network policy, but in their case, they ended up choosing workload-based network policy primarily because the whole policy thing was implemented differently by different plugins. So the lowest common denominator that could satisfy every implementation of network policy was to target workloads. And they did have back and forth between service-based network policy and workload-based network policy, but to satisfy every plugin, they ended up with workload-based network policy.
Right, and they wanted completeness. Right, service was not going to allow them to offer completeness.
Yes, yeah. With workload-based policy, you can be functionally address all your scenarios, even if sometimes you might be inefficient because you're targeting policies per backend as opposed to targeting it against the logical service. But functionally, you can cover it. And so they ended up doing, after back and forth between service-based policy and workload-based policy, they ended up converging on workload-based policy. But I agree that service-based policy has obviously a lot of merit. So an ideal solution would combine both.
Sorry, Eitan, you had your hand up, but then you dropped it.
Oh, I was just wondering, like, what would the behavior be in this world? You know, if an IP, because really what we're talking about is not being able to target IPs. So what would the behavior be from the Z-tunnel perspective? And also, what use cases are we totally limiting? I think potentially stateful sets are a bit of a limiting example. They're sort of the first to come to mind, but they're also, you know, not necessarily indicative of the whole pool. So I'm wondering, yeah, what we'd be limiting ourselves to, and what the behavior would be if we, you know, if we didn't have those, if the user targeted an IP, it would just go straight to the destination, or what would even happen?
Traffic must flow, right? So the only decision is, does the client-side ZTOL make the decision to go to the waypoint or not? And then can the waypoint forward the traffic or not? And then probably a compliant waypoint implementation would check if the IP it was forwarding the traffic to was part of the same trust domain as itself. Or not, if it was
right. I mean, assuming
didn't have a Z-tunnel.
Assuming that the IPs just weren't, assuming that we didn't support stateful sets, right? Like, where would the traffic wouldn't go to a waypoint, would it?
Yeah, no, that's the first part, right? Right, that's the whole, like, is a waypoint a structural guarantee around a forward proxy or not?
No, I understand. So I'm like polling, you know, what would we do then?
Oh.
Right, like, what would the behavior be? Would we just say, you know, would we reject? I mean, the thing I'm thinking about, and I think about pretty consistently with things like this, is like, what we're trying to do is provide value on top of existing services, right? So if we say that you user have to change your targets, your application to properly use Istio, to properly use Ambient, is that, like, are we making the right decision?
We try to avoid having people change applications, right?
Yeah.
So
it seems like this would require that to some degree.
No, I don't think so.
No.
Yeah, so Eitan, in this case, I would, so if the traffic is not forwarded to waypoint, I would hope if it's a layer 4 policy, the destination Z tunnel would be able to enforce it, right? If it's a layer 7, then we don't have anybody enforce it.
I understand. So we just go to the destination Z tunnel, and we just skip the waypoint. Okay, that was the question.
That's what I would think. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so what's the next step? I mean, we discussed a tons of stuff. I don't think we have enough consensus either, right? To have the traffic always go to the waypoint, and also should we do service-based with workload-based?
So I think we need a doc on this point, right? Like we need to call out examples. We need to look at the pros and cons argument and the complexity, right? And some of the points here, like we can decouple policy from this choice, right? So does decoupling policy from this choice, like what impacts does that have on complexity? Is complexity the primary concern? Like John, because I heard a little bit of a mixture of a complexity argument and a feature function argument, right? And then what are the other, like if we make other choices, what are the trade-offs in complexity, like a different operational model? Like I'm happy to go work on this doc with folks, but we obviously need something that's a bit more in depth.
Yep, definitely.
And then do we need to go and like, I haven't been back into the hairpin document in a while, sorry. But it seems like we may want to go take another look at that document once we've taken a pass at this document. Is that also fair?
That seems reasonable.
And again, I think a lot of the arguments on the hairpin is all about the complexity of it, right? Like it's funky. Right? Like, I
And
think
performance. I mean, local traffic is
Okay.
not local.
yeah, okay. All right. Okay, John, do you want to work on a doc with me, and we'll beat our heads against this wall? And
Yep, I've already started one a bit, so I'll clean it up. Sure.
okay, of course you have. Should have assumed that from the beginning. And vendors, think about your requirements. What are you trying to do? Right, because if you're asking for a contract, right, I'm a vendor too, so I'm going to think about this as well. What do you want to be able to do? Because speak now or forever hold your peace when it comes to contracts.
Yeah, I'll try to come with my thoughts a little more organized on that topic next week.
And Keith, you were crabbing along on that one. Keith might have dropped off. But
Yeah, he dropped.
Sanjeev, I don't actually know who you work for. Do you work for a lovely vendor too? Everybody works for a vendor, I suppose. So.
Yeah, I work for Red Hat.
Okay. Yes, you definitely work for vendor. So think about.
Yeah, I'm new to Ambient, so just getting up to speed and sort of trying to figure this thing out.
Well, welcome.
Thanks.
Appreciate the discussion.
Are you also working on Kiali and the observability part, or just networking?
Cluster networking, although I'm not in a product team, I'm in the CTO team.
You seem to know what you're talking about, so you're definitely very welcome.
I did the Cisco thing for years, so now this L7 stuff, new.
I'm the opposite. I'm going the opposite direction. I'll end up working in hardware next. All right, we're way over time. I'll work with John and try and get as much captured as possible. Thanks, everyone. It's a good discussion.
Thanks, everybody.